from doing it. Somebody who is trying to stand on water and walk on water, which they cannot do under the law of nature, can have a helicopter standing by above them with a line tied to them, and they're not going to sink. They can stand on the water and actually walk on the water as the helicopter moves a little bit. They can do it. Now, I know that sounds silly, but what I'm sharing with you is to say that we have sufficient evidence that guarantees there can be no exception to the laws of nature, I think, is incorrect. There are things that can be. Okay, if we would, let's move a little bit further. And by the way, the one who came up with the statement that has to do with the observable, repeatable, and regular concepts for the laws of nature, and that there are no exceptions, was David Hume, and he was in the 17th century, 1711 to 1776, and he's the one who said, quote, "We have uniform experience against miracles, and that miracles are exceptions to natural laws." If he would have just stopped there, it would have been okay. He goes on to say, "which have no exceptions." So there can be no exceptions. And if you say without knowing everything that can possibly ever happen to affect the law of nature, that is a law of nature that has no exceptions, would be an improper statement. Yes?
So a person making that statement has to attribute the attributes of God to himself.
Okay, we haven't gone that far. You're just stepping ahead of me for a moment. At this point in time, all I said was that if there's anything that can come alongside of that law of nature in that specific instant and alter it in some way, then you can't say it's an impossible thing for a miracle to take place. Something will alter it, whether it be God or someone that God empowers to do it. That's one thing, but there are many other different ways, such as this gentleman who said earlier that there are other natural laws that came into existence, that came into play at the same time, that altered that from happening. Yes?
I'm sure you're going to cover this in that aspect of miracles being fake, fake miracles. For example, a magician did walk on water. It was on television. It showed him walking on water. And he was able to do it because he had these clear acrylic platforms underneath.
Yeah.
No one could see.
Okay, but that's a fake.
That's a fake
miracle.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. But we'll talk about so-called faith miracles.
That's right.
What time do I have till?
Keep rolling.
Jeez, you gotta be kidding.
Move it along.
Okay, so let's go along. Let's move on here. What I'm saying to you is that miracles properly understood confirm the authority of God and his revelation through the prophets and the apostles as found in the Bible. These miracles do not violate God's system or natural laws which he created. They add to them. In other words, nobody is trying to violate the natural laws. But if one can come alongside that natural law and do something that would alter and change that natural law on a temporary basis to accomplish something, that's a different story. And if you believe in God at all, and you believe in his attributes that he has, then you cannot say that God could not be that force that comes alongside that natural order, which, by the way, from Scripture tells us that he created to begin with. And if that be the case, assuming that God, for a moment, did indeed create the universe and all that exists in it. He created the natural laws. And if he created the natural laws, he can surely come alongside any one of those natural laws, and he could affect it temporarily to accomplish, quote unquote, a miracle. Is all that we're saying at this point in time. All right, I want to talk about going to extra biblical evidence for the historicity of Jesus. And hopefully this will all come together in just a moment or two. Extra biblical evidence for the historicity of Jesus, his literal physical existence on earth as the Bible depicts him, not simply a myth. In other words, does that individual whom we call Jesus of Nazareth, who is found throughout the whole Bible, especially in the New Covenant, New Testament, did he really exist? Was he a genuine person on the earth? Or was he a fable? Was he made up? Is he a myth? Is he a spiritual being that nobody can have any evidence that he really exists? Or did he honestly exist on the earth? Extra biblical, meaning outside of the Bible, do we have evidence that Jesus really existed?
Isn't that what Beck's book, Killing of Jesus, was all about? Was a historical fact that the man was there in the events that took place in his life?
Yes. Yes, I agree.
But the book The Zealot was all about who didn't exist necessarily.
Okay, let me simply, before we get there, and I can't get, I didn't even get started yet.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, he has, I'm giving him 10 more minutes, so let him finish, okay, and then we can talk about it.
Okay. I want to talk about the affirmation from on-the-scene historians, meaning those who were present and are absolutely valid historians and accepted to this day throughout all the world. And the two come to mind: Cornelius Tacitus, who lived in 55 CE, Common Era, up to 118 CE, which means he bridged that whole period of time just after Jesus was here. Jesus would have, as a human being, assuming he existed on the earth, according to the Bible, he would have died in the early 32 AD period of time. And then a lot has transpired thereafter. And Cornelius Tacitus, he was a Roman senator, an orator, an ethnographer, and one of the best Roman historians. In his last major work called The Annals, he mentioned Christ, who was executed by Pontius Pilate and from whom the Christians derived their name. Now, you can't come up with something more in strength for a belief of the existence of Jesus than someone who was there at that point in time, understood what went on, and wrote in history, and is able to be found today, wrote it down that Pontius Pilate was involved in executing this one called Christ, who the Christians were named after. Secondly, Flavius Josephus, one of my kinsmen, a Jewish man who was born and raised in Israel, in a Jewish priestly family. He lived 37 CE to 100 CE. He was, I said that he had been born and raised in Israel. He wrote only a couple of decades after Jesus' death, and in the book called 20 of his work, Jewish Antiquities, which is a major book out there today, he made reference to James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. And he was involved with the Roman Empire as well. He actually became what most Jewish people would tell you, a traitor to the Jewish people, because in AD 70, He betrayed the Jewish people, and without giving you all the history, became well liked in the Roman Empire, and he did a lot of the writing of history of that first century. And let me just simply tell you this: the Romans hated the Christians, and the Romans hated the Jewish people. And there is no way that the Romans would have affected Josephus in saying, write about this Jesus, that he lived if he didn't live. And so what we have here are two major historians that are well known today that give rise to the belief system that Jesus, as a human being, did indeed live and function here on the earth in the land of Israel back in the first century. The third thing I would tell you about that is that Judaism itself does not today, nor ever have, especially in that first century, ever denied the existence of Jesus. They never did. They denied his belief system. They didn't accept the fact that he called himself their Messiah and the Son of God. They did not accept that, except for people like my wife and I and other Jewish people today that have already done so. There were those in that period. In fact, the first church in all the world was started by all Jewish believers in Jesus in Israel, right after his death, burial, and resurrection. But the nation as a whole and the leadership of Israel, especially the religious leadership, they denied his teachings, but they never, ever came to a place of denying him, that he existed, to this very day. Okay, real quick, and I think it's important for me to try to get you to this. I wanted to deal with the science of probabilities, talking about the veracity of Jesus and his miracles. I'm not going to go through all of these. I can't, we don't have the time. Maybe another time we can do this. But I want you to write something down because you'll want to check this out on your own. It'll be well worth your while. There's a book that was written back in 1958 by Dr. Stoner that has to do with the probabilities of science and the actual reality of Jesus as a person. And you can go to, and I was going to give you quite a bit about that, but you can go to Science Speaks, one word, .dstoner.net. And there you will find not only the book that I was quoting from, if I was going to be able to do all this for you, that I was quoting from, but you will find that that book has been enhanced substantially, upgraded with current up-to-date science, along with what the proofs from the Bible concerning the validity of Jesus as a person on the earth. And that book you can see and even download, I'm pretty sure, but if you didn't, you can read it to your heart's content, free of charge on that site. It's very valuable, very good. It gives you a lot of good input. The other I was going to tell you is that there's a list of 360 messianic prophecies fulfilled in Jesus that is prophetic teaching from the Old Testament concerning that there would be this one called the Messiah, and 360 of those prophecies are made in the Old Testament, and centuries later, all of them were fulfilled in this one person called Jesus. No other person is, today it's beyond any question, no other person can fulfill it, because there are things that would have happened or needed to happen to be fulfilled that goes back into the first century. So anyone who's alive today that wants to say, I'm the Messiah, cannot do so. The only person that can fulfill all 360 of these prophecies is none other than the person called Jesus. Now that doesn't prove his historicity. It proves his veracity. Because in the New Testament, Jesus made the following statements himself. And it's